The Andes in October hold two seasons at once. Below 4,000 meters, the slopes still breathe green. Above that line, the air thins and the rock goes white. Snow sits year-round on the peaks. Wind moves across the ridges without interruption. There are no roads, no settlements. The mountains form a wall between Chile and Argentina that runs unbroken for thousands of kilometers. In daylight, the peaks gleam. At night, they vanish into cold that drops below 20 degrees Celsius. The silence is absolute. Nothing grows at altitude, nothing moves unless the wind pushes it. On the afternoon of October 13th, 1972, a chartered Fairchild FH227D turboprop carrying 45 people crossed into Argentine airspace heading for Santiago. The plane belonged to the Uruguayan Air Force. Most of the passengers were members of a rugby team from Montevideo, along with friends and family. They were young. The oldest was in his 20s. They had boarded in Montevideo that morning. The flight stopped in Mendoza, Argentina, to refuel. Weather reports indicated a front moving through the mountains. The crew waited an hour, then departed. Standard procedure was to follow a valley corridor that threaded between the higher peaks. Visibility was poor. Cloud cover sat low. The pilots relied on instruments and radio beacons. At 14:45 local time, air traffic control in Santiago cleared the flight to begin descent. The crew acknowledged. 4 minutes later, the plane struck a ridge at approximately 4,200 meters. The right wing sheared off, then the left. The fuselage tumbled forward and slid several hundred meters down a glacier before coming to rest in deep snow. 12 people died in the impact or within hours. The rear section separated and fell away, taking several passengers with it. The cockpit was destroyed. Both pilots were killed. The fuselage came to rest on its belly, partially intact. Inside, survivors lay among twisted metal and torn seats. Snow had forced its way through gaps in the hull. The temperature was already dropping. Altitude made breathing difficult. Several passengers were injured, some critically. Broken legs, fractured skulls, internal trauma. There were no doctors aboard. One of the survivors, a medical student named Roberto Canessa, began assessing injuries with limited knowledge and no equipment. The fuselage provided minimal shelter. Wind moved through the openings. At night, the cold deepened. The passengers had been traveling to a rugby match. The team was called the Old Christians Club. Most were students. They came from middle-class families in Montevideo. A few had experience with outdoor sports, but none had mountaineering training. None were equipped for high-altitude survival. They wore street clothes, light jackets, sneakers. The plane carried minimal emergency supplies. No winter gear, no flares. The radio was damaged. Attempts to signal for help failed. The survivors assumed rescue would come quickly. They believed search teams would find the white fuselage against the snow. They did not yet understand how large the search area was or how poor the visibility had been. They did not know that air traffic control had miscalculated the plane's position by over 100 kilometers. Search aircraft began combing valleys to the west, far from the actual crash site. In the first days, they rationed the food salvaged from the wreckage: chocolate bars, crackers, a few bottles of wine. Snacks passengers had carried for the trip. The supplies were gone within a week. Snow surrounded the site in every direction. There was no vegetation, no animals, no water, except what they melted from snow, using metal scraps held in the sun. Hunger set in quickly. At altitude, the body burns calories faster. Cold accelerates the loss. Several survivors grew weak. The injured required constant care, but had no medicine. Infections began to develop. One young man, a team captain named Marcelo Perez, tried to organize the group. He assigned tasks: melting snow, insulating gaps in the fuselage, caring for the wounded. Morale was fragile. Some prayed, others argued, all waited. By the 8th day, it became clear that rescue was not imminent. The survivors began discussing options. Walking out seemed impossible. The mountains in every direction were steep and snow-covered. No one knew which way led to safety. The altitude made exertion exhausting. Some suggested waiting until spring, when snow would melt and search efforts might resume. Others understood they would not survive that long. The cold at night was unbearable. They huddled together for warmth inside the fuselage. Sleep came in brief intervals. Frostbite appeared on fingers and toes. One boy lost feeling in his feet. Another developed an infection in a leg wound. There was no antiseptic, no bandages except torn fabric. Roberto Canessa and another medical student, Gustavo Zerbino, did what they could, but resources were non-existent. On the 10th day, someone found a transistor radio in the wreckage. They managed to get it working. Listening to news broadcasts from Chile, they learned that search operations had been called off. Authorities declared the passengers lost. The announcement was delivered matter-of-factly by the news anchor. The survivors sat in silence. No one spoke for a long time. The realization settled slowly. They were alone. No one was coming. If they were to survive, it would be by their own effort. The decision that followed was not made lightly. It was not made all at once. It emerged over days of hunger and cold and the visible decline of their companions. The dead lay outside, preserved by the cold. The survivors had no food. The discussion, when it finally occurred, was quiet and careful. Some refused at first. Others understood there was no alternative. The bodies of their friends and family members became the only available source of sustenance. The act itself is not recorded in detail by those who survived. Accounts vary in specifics. What is clear is that it began out of necessity and was conducted with as much respect as circumstances allowed. Small portions were taken. Preparation was minimal. Consumption was difficult. Some could not do it. Others forced themselves. No one spoke while it happened. The practice continued for weeks. It was not discussed openly. It became routine. Survival required it. Morality, in the language of the survivors, was redefined by context. Several were devoutly Catholic. They reconciled the act through theological reasoning. One survivor later described it as a form of communion. Another said simply that the dead had given them permission to live. Weeks passed. The injured either stabilized or died. An avalanche struck the fuselage on the night of October 29th, burying the interior in snow. 8 more people suffocated or were crushed. The survivors dug themselves out. The loss was devastating. Morale collapsed. Marcelo Perez, who had held the group together, was among the dead. Leadership fractured. Arguments became more frequent. The cold was constant. Nights stretched without end. At altitude, darkness fell early and lifted late. The horizon offered no variation. White slopes under white sky. Wind that never stopped. Time became difficult to measure. Days blurred. Routine was the only structure. Melt snow, eat, sleep in shifts, tend to frostbite, repeat. By mid-November, it was clear that waiting would kill them all. A group of survivors began planning an expedition. The idea was to climb west toward Chile, where they believed the terrain eventually descended into populated valleys. No one had maps. No one had climbing experience. The altitude alone made walking difficult. The snow was deep and unstable. The first attempts failed within hours. Exhaustion forced them back, but the alternative was certain death. On December 12th, 3 men set out: Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parrado, and Antonio Vizintin. They carried makeshift supplies, sleeping bags sewn from insulation, meat wrapped in cloth. They climbed for days. The ridge they ascended seemed endless. At night, they dug into the snow and huddled together. Temperatures dropped below -20. Frostbite worsened. Vizintin turned back to lighten the load. Canessa and Parrado continued. They walked for 10 days. The mountains did not end. Every ridge revealed another. The snow gave way to rock, then back to snow. They rationed their food down to nothing. Exhaustion became total. On December 21st, they crested a final ridge and saw green below, a valley, a river. The sight did not bring relief, only the understanding that they still had kilometers to descend. They stumbled downward. On the 22nd, they encountered a man on horseback near a remote Chilean cattle station. The man, Sergio Catalan, saw 2 figures emerging from the wilderness, skeletal and frostbitten. He offered food and rode for help. Chilean authorities were notified. Helicopters were dispatched. On December 23rd, 72 days after the crash, helicopters reached the wreckage. 14 survivors remained at the site. They emerged from the fuselage into daylight. Rescue teams found the site, marked by debris and the remains of those who had died. The scene was carefully documented. The survivors were evacuated in stages due to altitude and weather. They were flown to hospitals in Santiago. News of the rescue spread quickly. Within days, details of their survival emerged. The fact of cannibalism became public. Initial reports were sensational. The survivors faced scrutiny. Interviews were conducted. Moral questions were raised. Religious authorities were consulted. The Vatican issued a statement acknowledging the extreme circumstances. The families of the dead responded with varying degrees of acceptance. Some understood, others withdrew. The 16 who survived returned to Uruguay. They were young men when they boarded the plane. What they became afterward is harder to describe. Some spoke publicly, others did not. Roberto Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist. Fernando Parrado went into business. Several wrote memoirs or participated in documentaries. Their accounts are measured, they do not glorify. They do not justify beyond stating fact. What happened in the Andes was survival reduced to its simplest terms. Cold, hunger, time. The decisions made were not heroic. They were necessary. The line between life and death was crossed not through courage, but through the absence of alternatives. The Andes are still remote. The crash site remains difficult to reach. Over the decades, pieces of the wreckage have been recovered or buried by snow. A cross was erected at the site by the survivors. It stands on the slope where the fuselage came to rest. The altitude is marked. The silence is unchanged. The story of Flight 571 has entered historical record not as tragedy alone, but as a study in endurance. It asks uncomfortable questions. It offers no comfortable answers. What the survivors did was not unique in the history of extreme survival, but the clarity with which it was documented and the youth of those involved gave it a particular weight. They were not soldiers, not explorers. They were students on their way to a rugby match who learned that the night, when it comes, can last longer than anyone believes possible, and that sometimes, when morning finally arrives, the cost of reaching it is so high that the light itself changes meaning.